Alright, here we are with concept 31.2. It says fungi produce spores through sexual or asexual life cycles. Let's start off with a little good news here. In this particular concept, point 2, 31.2, you're going to see that fungi reproduce in any possible way. If there is a way of reproducing, fungi probably have at least some of them that reproduce that way. So the good news is I'm not going to ask you to recall every method of reproduction for all of the major types of fungi that we're going to take a look at, but I want you to be familiar with the overall basics. So if I say on a test, for example, I'm not going to ask you to recount the exact reproductive method of the basidiocarps, which you're going to find out is a particular type of mushroom that we're going to take a look at. So I'm not going to ask you the particulars of every type of fungi that we're going to take a look at, but you need to know sort of the basics, the overall understanding of how most fungi reproduce. So it says fungi propagate themselves by producing vast numbers of spores, either sexually or asexually. Fungi can produce spores from different types of life cycles, and you're going to see that there's many different varieties when it comes to fungi. They will reproduce in any possible way. Once again, this is a group of living creatures that reproduce in an astounding number of ways, and by comparison, just regular old standard mammalian reproduction is pretty darn boring and straightforward. So I wouldn't ask you to memorize all of what you're about to see, but certainly I want you to know the overall basics. We're going to find out that there are portions of the life cycle of many of the fungi that are haploid. In other words, they have a single set of the genetics. So that would be more similar to, say, a sperm cell or an egg cell where it's only a half a set. And then we're going to find out that there's a portion of the life cycle which is diploid, which is more like what we consider a normal, say, a normal mammal or a human that has a duplicate set of chromosomes, one from each parent. And there's also something called heterokaryotic. So heterokaryotic, we'll discuss that in just a little bit as well. So let me show you some of the terms we're going to take a look at. Some of the terms we need to understand: heterokaryotic, plasmogamy, and then let's see, karyogamy. Germination you're already familiar with. Mycelium we already know is all the little strands that make up the fungus, so that would be the hyphae all kind of stranded together. We know what spores are, so really it's plasmogamy, karyogamy, and then perhaps a heterokaryotic stage. Those are three words that we're not familiar with that we'll make sure that we are familiar with by the end of the chapter. First, let's take a look at the different ways of sexual reproduction that fungi might have. Fungal nuclei are normally haploid, meaning they have half a set of the normal full complement of genetics, with the exception of transient diploid stages formed during the sexual life cycles. So for the most part, the fungal nuclei are going to be in a haploid state. Sexual reproduction requires the fusion of hyphae from different mating types. We don't really call them male and female because they're not really males and females when you're talking about fungi. Sometimes they're called X and Y, or negative and positive, or type 1 and type 2, but we describe them as mating types instead of sexes. Fungi use sexual signaling molecules called pheromones to communicate their mating type. So they'll put out these certain chemicals within the soil or within their environment called pheromones. Many different types of living creatures put out different kinds of signaling molecules called pheromones, including humans and mammals and other creatures. So fungi use these pheromones to kind of signal to other fungi around them as to what their mating type is. The first word that we saw in that chart that we're probably not familiar with is what's called plasmogamy. Plasmogamy is the union of cytoplasm from two parent myceliae when two different mating types fuse hyphae together. So when two different mating types are near each other and they send out this signal molecule, pheromones, that will cause them to grow toward each other, and they will undergo basically a union between two of the hyphae. They will join together, and this union is called plasmogamy. In most fungi, the haploid nuclei from each parent do not fuse right away. So you'll have these hyphae that grow together, but within this now grown together hyphae, you'll have two different sets of haploid nuclei, one from one mating type and one from another. And they don't normally fuse together right away. So they may exist for some time in this coexisting state in the mycelium where there's two separate haploid nuclei, and that's called heterokaryon. Hetero meaning different or unalike. So heterokaryon. So that's the state at which they have fused together physically, but the nuclei have yet to fuse together. In some fungi, the haploid nuclei pair off two to a cell, such as And when they do that, that type of mycelium is called dikaryotic, di meaning two. So they may have cells if this is a septate a septate mycelium or a septate hyphae, whether it's kind of divided into cells. There may be these two diploid nuclei from the two different mating types within that cell, but they still haven't fused together, and so we call that dikaryotic. Sometimes hours, days, sometimes even, as unbelievable as it sounds, centuries after plasmogamy, you may then get a fusion of the nuclei. So some amount of time can pass, and they can be in this plasmogamy state for quite some time before you finally get this fusion of the nuclei, and that's the third word that we were looking at, the karyogamy. Karyogamy is when you have nuclear fusion between those two different mating types. During karyogamy, the haploid nuclei fuse, producing diploid cells. This diploid phase is not very long-lived. It's a short-lived phase. It undergoes meiosis, which then produces haploid spores. So we're back to a haploid state again. The paired process of karyogamy and meiosis produces genetic variation. So through those stages, we'll go back and take a look at the words here. Through plasmogamy, which is like the physical joining of the hyphae of the two different parent types, and then for quite some time they can be in a heterokaryotic stage, and then eventually the nuclei will fuse through karyogamy. That will create a diploid zygote, which isn't around very long. It undergoes meiosis and creates haploid spores, and then we start the whole process over again. So this is sexual reproduction in the right hand circle over here. Now, of course, a lot of fungi can produce asexually as well. In addition to sexual reproduction, many fungi produce asexually. Some of them can actually do both. Many of them can actually do both. Molds are a good example where they produce haploid spores by mitosis, and they form visible mycelia. So if you've ever gotten a piece of bread out of the bag and you're going to make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and you get that kind of smell, it kind of smells like it's souring, or sometimes it even smells like alcohol fermentation, and you see mold and you see kind of the little fuzz on the bread. That is haploid spores produced by mitosis, and then the mycelia that you see is kind of the fuzz that's there on the bread. So here's another good shot of this type of mold called penicillium, which is something you're probably familiar with. We get the medication penicillin from that. This is a mold that's commonly encountered on decomposing food like this orange, and if you zoom in, you see these spore producing fruiting bodies at the top of these stalks right here, and this is all asexual reproduction. So molds commonly produce asexually. Another fungi that reproduce asexually are yeasts, which are single cells. Instead of producing spores, yeast reproduce asexually by cell division and a process called budding, where they simply pinch a portion of themselves off and form these bud cells that eventually will separate and become a new cell. Some fungi can grow as yeast and as filamentous mycelia, depending on the conditions. So a lot of fungi can kind of switch between the sort of the yeast way of life or the mycelia way of life, depending on the conditions. And here's a good example of a very common type of yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is, you can see the parent cells and then little buds. You can see these smaller little bud protrusions coming off of the parent cells, and they will eventually separate and become their own separate cell. There are many known molds and yeasts that have no known sexual stage. We have studied them for quite some time and have not found any sort of sexual diploid stage. So what we usually do is, until we find such a stage, we kind of all lump these guys together. Mycologists, which are scientists who study different types of fungi, mycologists have traditionally called these deuteromycetes, or imperfect fungi. And so deuteromycetes is not really a sound taxonomic group, it's just kind of a holding pen. So when we first study or find a new species of a mold or a yeast, but we have yet to see or find its sexual stage, we kind of just throw it into this holding pen called deuteromycetes, and then we kind of reclassify it or try to classify it based on its various sexual stages if we discover that or when we discover that. So backing up to our chart, we could look at the left hand side here. This is asexual reproduction, so you would have mycelium, or in the case of yeast, single cells. If it's mycelium, they'll produce spore structures, and those spores would be all haploid. Notice this entire portion is haploid. Those haploid spores will then germinate and continue that process. So a lot of the fungi can reproduce either asexually by producing haploid spores, or they can go through this sexual stage where they join with another parent type, and they'll go through plasmogamy, and then usually karyogamy, a brief diploid stage, and then back to haploid again. So again, the fungi have a tremendous number of ways of reproducing, and there's all sorts of varieties of these two combinations. So as we talk about these different fungi, you're going to see all these different varieties. I don't expect you to memorize each particular type of reproduction, but I would want you to be familiar with this kind of overall idea of sexual reproduction and asexual and the ways that it can happen. We're going to take a break right there, and then we'll start talking about some details. So we'll stop right there with the basics of reproduction of the fungi, and then we'll move on to this concept talking about the basics for how we understand how the fungi began as a group. We'll come back to that in just 1 second.